Open your banking app right now. Look at that number. Your savings account, your retirement fund, whatever you've worked years to build. Now cut that number in half. That's what it will be worth in 2040. Not because of a market crash, not because of hackers, but because the Federal Reserve has a plan and you are the one paying for it. Here's what they don't teach you in school. When the government owes $38 trillion dollars and has no way to pay it back, they don't send you a bill. They don't raise your taxes, not directly anyway. They do something far more sophisticated. They steal from you invisibly, 1 percentage point at a time. It's called inflation, but that word has been sanitized. It sounds like an economic term, something abstract that happens to quote zero. Let me reframe it for you. Inflation is a hidden tax. It is the government reaching into your wallet while you sleep and taking a little bit every single night. Right now, the official inflation rate is around 3 to 4%. The Federal Reserve tells you this is normal, manageable, transitory, but let's do the math they hope you never do. At 5% inflation per year, your money loses half its value in 14 years. If you have $100,000 in savings today, by 2040 it will have the purchasing power of $50,000. You didn't spend it. You didn't lose it in a bad investment. The Federal Reserve simply erased it. This is not a prediction, this is the plan. Let me introduce you to Robert Chen, a 54-year-old high school chemistry teacher in Columbus, Ohio. Robert did everything right, started saving at 25, maxed out his 401k every single year for 29 years. Put additional money in a high-yield savings account at his bank that pays 4% interest. Robert has $380,000 saved for retirement, which he plans to start in 2035 when he turns 65. Robert thinks he's safe. He thinks he's building wealth. He looks at his quarterly statements and sees the number go up, and he feels good. He's on track. He's responsible. He's one of the smart ones. But here's what Robert doesn't know. At current inflation rates, real inflation, not the government's manipulated CPI, his $380,000 will have the purchasing power of roughly $190,000 by the time he retires. He's been working for 29 years, saving diligently, sacrificing vacations and new cars and nice dinners out to build a pile of money that will be worth half what he thinks it's worth. Robert is not unlucky. Robert is not bad at math. Robert is the target. He is exactly who the Federal Reserve needs to pay off the national debt. Savers like Robert, responsible, disciplined, trusting, are the collateral damage in the government's war on debt. You might be thinking, quote 2, that was the old job. We are now living under a new regime called fiscal dominance. The Federal Reserve is no longer independent. It no longer works for you. It works for the Treasury Department. Its primary mission is no longer to fight inflation. Its primary mission is to keep the United States government solvent. Here's the problem. The U.S. government is spending more on interest payments on the debt than it is spending on the entire military. The interest bill is approaching $1 trillion per year. And it's accelerating. If the Federal Reserve raised interest rates to 10%, like Paul Volcker did in the 1980s to crush inflation, the interest payments on $38 trillion would be $3.8 trillion per year. That is more than the total tax revenue of the United States government. The government would collapse overnight. Social Security checks would bounce. Medicare would stop. Federal employees wouldn't get paid. So the Fed is trapped. It cannot raise rates high enough to actually stop inflation because doing so would bankrupt the country. Instead, it has to keep rates artificially low, below the real rate of inflation. This creates negative real interest rates. And negative real interest rates are the weapon they use to steal your wealth. Let me show you exactly how they do it. The Federal Reserve uses 3 tools to ensure that you cannot escape and that you don't even realize you're being robbed until it's too late. Tool number 1, the captive buyer. In a free market, if a government is $38 trillion in debt and spending recklessly, investors would demand 15% interest. But the U.S. government can't afford that. At $38 trillion, 15% interest would be $5.7 trillion per year, nearly double total federal tax revenue. So they rigged the game. Through regulations like Basel III and Dodd-Frank, the government forces banks, pension funds, and insurance companies to buy U.S. Treasury bonds. Regulators classify treasuries as high-quality liquid assets. Banks must hold them to stay in business. It doesn't matter if bonds pay 3.5% while inflation runs at 5%. The regulations force financial institutions to lose money on government debt. Meet Patricia Williams, a pension fund manager in Denver, managing $2.3 billion for the Colorado Teachers Retirement Fund. 38,000 retired educators depending on this money to survive. Patricia knows Treasury bonds at 3.5% are terrible when inflation is 5%. She's losing 1.5% per year in real terms, $34.5 million annually in purchasing power and evaporating. Her retirees get poorer every day, but Patricia has no choice. Under Basel III, she must allocate 40% to quote 4, which regulators define as U.S. Treasury bonds. If she refuses, the fund loses regulatory approval. It shuts down. The teachers lose everything. Patricia is trapped. Her 38,000 teachers are trapped, and the Fed is counting on it. This is financial conscription. You are forced to lend money to a bankrupt government at negative real rates. You are guaranteed to lose. Tool number 2, the broken thermometer. If you want to pay people less but you promise to pay them based on inflation, the easiest solution is to lie about inflation. Social Security payments are tied to the Consumer Price Index, CPI. If CPI says inflation is 3%, retirees get a 3% cost of living adjustment. If CPI says inflation is 8%, the government has to pay 8% more across the entire Social Security system. With 67 million Americans receiving Social Security, every percentage point costs the government roughly $14 billion per year. The government has a $1 trillion incentive to keep the CPI number as low as possible. So they cheat. Picture this. It's Tuesday morning at the Bureau of Labor Statistics headquarters in Washington, D.C. A room full of economists with PhDs from Harvard, MIT, and Princeton are sitting around a conference table literally deciding what inflation is. Not measuring it, deciding it. They're looking at the latest grocery price data. Ribeye steak went from $12.99 per pound last year to $18.99 this year. That's a 46% increase. Do they report 46% inflation in beef? Absolutely not. They apply something called quote 5. The logic goes like this. If the price of steak goes up, rational consumers won't buy steak anymore. They'll substitute down to a cheaper alternative, maybe ground beef at $6.99 per pound. Therefore, according to the BLS, your actual cost of living didn't go up that much. You're still eating beef, just a different kind. See the trick? They measure your declining standard of living and call it stable prices. Meanwhile, in a suburb of Cleveland, Margaret Foster, 72 years old, is standing in the meat section of her local Kroger. Margaret has been buying ribeye steak for Sunday dinner for 40 years. It's a tradition she started when her husband was alive. It's how she shows love to her 3 grandkids when they visit. Ribeye on Sunday, medium rare, with roasted potatoes and green beans. It's one of the few pleasures she has left. But today, Margaret is staring at the price tag. $18.99 per pound. She needs 3 pounds for her family. That's $57 plus tax. Her Social Security check is $1,847 per month. After rent, utilities, and medication, she has about $400 left for food for the entire month. Margaret stands there for 2 full minutes, doing mental math. Then she puts the ribeye back. She picks up a package of chicken thighs instead, $2.99 per pound. It's not the same. Her grandkids will notice, but it's what she can afford. Margaret's standard of living just declined. Her joy just declined. The tradition that connected her to her late husband just ended. But tomorrow, the Bureau of Labor Statistics will announce that inflation is moderating at 3.2%, and Margaret's Social Security check will increase by 2.8% next year instead of the 7% she actually needs. The economists in D.C. don't see Margaret. They see a data point that behaved exactly as their model predicted. Substitution bias is working perfectly. The system is designed to make Margaret poorer while telling her everything is fine. They also use something called hedonic adjustments. If a new iPhone costs $1,200 and last year's model costs $1,000, but the new one has a better camera and faster processor, the government says the price didn't really go up. They adjust the increase downward because you're getting, quote, seven, quote. By these statistical gymnastics, substitution bias, hedonic adjustments, geometric weighting, the government saves hundreds of billions in payments every year. If we use the 1980 methodology to calculate CPI today, inflation would be running at 8 to 10%, not 3 to 4%. But if they admitted that, Social Security, veteran benefits, and federal pensions would bankrupt the Treasury even faster. They are gaslighting you about the cost of your own survival to protect the federal budget. The thermometer is broken on purpose. Tool number 3, the money printer. When foreign countries like China and Japan stop buying U.S. debt, which they've been doing for years, someone must step in. That someone is the Federal Reserve. The Fed prints money and buys Treasury bonds nobody else wants. This is quantitative easing, QE. It keeps government borrowing costs low, but floods the economy with new currency. Here's the exact mechanics. The Treasury needs $1 trillion for the deficit. They issue bonds. In a normal market, investors would demand 8% interest from a government $38 trillion in debt. But the government can't afford that. The Federal Reserve steps in. They don't have $1 trillion in a vault. They create it from nothing. A Fed official types, quote, 8, quote, into the digital ledger. The money now exists. The Fed buys the Treasury bonds with this invented money. The Treasury has $1 trillion to spend. That money enters circulation, government contracts, salaries, Social Security. It spreads through the economy. There are now $1 trillion more dollars chasing the same goods and services. Supply didn't increase, only dollars increased. By definition, prices must rise. Your existing dollars lost value. This cycle has repeated 8.5 trillion times since 2008. The Fed's balance sheet was $900 billion in 2008. Today it's $7.7 trillion. They didn't earn it, they invented it. You paid for it through inflation. Your savings didn't grow. The pile of dollars grew and your share shrank. This is legalized counterfeiting. You are the victim. Now here's where it gets truly evil. The theft is not hitting everyone equally. When the Federal Reserve prints $1 trillion, they don't mail a check to every American. They don't drop cash from helicopters over the heartland. They don't distribute it evenly. They inject the money into the financial system at the top. They buy bonds from Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, BlackRock, and other primary dealers. These institutions get the new money first at essentially zero interest. They use it immediately to buy assets, stocks, real estate, private equity, commodities. By the time this money trickles down to you in the form of wages, if it ever does, prices have already gone up. The rich get the money before inflation. You get the money after inflation. This is called the Cantillon effect, named after Richard Cantillon, an 18th century economist who discovered this pattern in 1730. It perfectly explains the K-shaped economy we're living in today. Let me show you exactly how this works in practice. In March 2020, when COVID lockdowns began, the Federal Reserve printed $4 trillion in 18 months. $4 trillion. Where did it go? Meet Michael Rodriguez, a managing partner at a private equity firm in Manhattan. Michael's firm borrowed $500 million at 1.2% interest from JP Morgan, money that JP Morgan got from the Federal Reserve at 0.25%. Michael used that $500 million to buy apartment complexes in Phoenix and Austin in late 2020 and early 2021, right when prices were still reasonable. By the time regular people heard about inflation in 2022, Michael had already locked in his real estate portfolio at pre-inflation prices. Those apartments have appreciated 40% since purchase. Michael's firm is up $180 million on paper, and they're collecting rent that's increased 35% in 2 years. Meanwhile, Jennifer Lopez, not the celebrity, a 34-year-old dental assistant in Phoenix making $52,000 per year, saw her rent go from $1,200 per month in 2020 to $1,650 per month in 2023. That's a 37.5% increase. That's an extra $5,400 per year, or about 10% of her pre-tax income. The apartment Jennifer is renting, it's in a complex that Michael's firm bought in 2020 with freshly printed Fed money. Michael Rodriguez is up $180 million. Jennifer Lopez is paying $450 more per month for the same apartment. The Federal Reserve printed the money. Michael got rich, Jennifer got poor, and the wealth gap widened. This is not a bug. This is not an accident. This is the system working exactly as designed. Since 2008, the wealth of the top 10% has exploded because the Fed has been systematically pumping up the value of the assets they own: stocks, bonds, real estate. The bottom 90% has seen wages stagnate in real terms, while the cost of rent, food, healthcare, and education has skyrocketed. The Federal Reserve is not creating prosperity, it is creating inequality. It is liquidating the middle class to pay off the national debt. And they're doing it so slowly that most people don't realize it's happening until it's too late. You think the government won't confiscate your wealth directly? You think there are legal limits to what they can do when they're desperate? Let me tell you what happened 91 years ago, because most Americans have never heard this story. April 5th, 1933. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102. In a single day, with the stroke of a pen, it became illegal for American citizens to own gold. Not gold jewelry, that was exempt up to $100 in value. But gold coins, gold bars, gold certificates, the actual monetary gold that people used to protect their savings from inflation, all of it became contraband overnight. American citizens had until May 1st, 1933 to turn in their gold to the Federal Reserve at the government's price, $20.67 per ounce. Not a market price, not a negotiated price, the government's price. If you refuse, you face 10 years in federal prison and a $10,000 fine, equivalent to about $230,000 in today's money. Thousands of Americans complied. They turned in their gold. They trusted the government. They believed it was temporary, a crisis measure that would be reversed once the economy recovered. Then here's the truly diabolical part. 9 months later, in January 1934, the Roosevelt administration revalued gold from $20.67 per ounce to $35 per ounce under the Gold Reserve Act. They forced American citizens to sell their gold at $20.67, then immediately turned around and devalued the dollar by 69% against gold. Think about what this means. If you owned $10,000 worth of gold in April 1933, the government forced you to exchange it for $10,000 in cash. Then 9 months later, that same amount of gold was worth $16,900. You lost $6,900, 69% of your wealth, through forced confiscation and currency devaluation. This wasn't wartime. This wasn't a foreign invasion. This was peacetime confiscation of private property by the U.S. government, and it remained illegal for American citizens to own gold until 1974. 41 years. The legal precedent exists. The mechanism exists. The playbook is still on the shelf. And today, politicians and economists are openly floating trial balloons about, quote, 9, quote, 10, quote, 11, quote, 12. When the government is desperate enough, and with $38 trillion in debt and $1 trillion in debt in annual interest payments, they are getting desperate. History shows they will take what they need, and they won't ask nicely. Let me show you where this leads. Weimar Germany, 1921 to 1923. The government was drowning in WWI reparations, 132 billion gold marks. They couldn't raise taxes enough. They couldn't cut spending, so they printed money. In January 1921, $1 bought 60 German marks. By November 1923, $1 bought 4.2 trillion marks. Prices doubled every 3.7 days. Workers were paid twice daily because by afternoon, morning wages were worthless. People burned money for heat, cheaper than firewood. The middle class was liquidated. Savings became worthless. Pensions vanished. Anyone holding cash was destroyed. Only those with hard assets survived: land, factories, gold, foreign currency. The U.S. isn't Weimar, not yet, but the dynamics are identical. Unsustainable debt, political paralysis, a central bank buying government bonds. The only difference is speed. Weimar hyperinflated in 2 years. The Fed is doing 5 to 7% annually instead of 500% monthly, but the destination is the same. The Fed has one more tool in development, a central bank digital currency, a CBDC. Right now, physical cash limits the Fed's control. If they set negative interest rates, you could withdraw cash and hold it. Physical cash is your escape hatch. A CBDC removes that forever. Picture 2028. Your daughter graduates college, gets her first job. Her $3,200 paycheck goes into a mandatory Fed account. No bank, just an app controlled by the Federal Reserve. She tries to save $500, but the Fed has implemented demurrage, negative interest rates. Her $500 becomes $499, then $498. They're punishing her for saving. She tries to buy a nice dinner. Transaction declined. Her money has smart contracts. The Fed decided restaurants above a certain price are, quote, 14, quote, her money only works at approved merchants. She tries to donate $100 to a political campaign opposing the Fed. Transaction declined. Account flagged. 3 days later, frozen pending review. This isn't science fiction. China already has this with the digital yuan. The European Central Bank is running pilots. The Fed has published research papers on CBDCs. Fed Chair Powell has testified to Congress about them. The transition to cashless isn't about convenience. It's about control. It's about eliminating your last option to opt out. You cannot save your way to wealth anymore. Saving in dollars is financial suicide. If you keep money in savings earning 4% while real inflation runs at 7%, you lose 3% annually. You're volunteering to fund the national debt. You are the donor class. Robert Chen with his $380,000? If he keeps it in safe investments, treasuries, savings accounts, he'll retire poor. The system ensures this outcome. The only protection is owning assets the government cannot print. Real estate in supply-constrained markets. Stocks in profitable companies with pricing power. Gold, silver, Bitcoin, commodities, energy infrastructure. Anything scarce. We've entered the era of forced speculation. To preserve purchasing power, not get rich, just stay even, you must take risks. The safe option of holding cash has been weaponized. The American dream, work hard, save money, retire comfortably, is dead. That system relied on stable currency and positive real rates. We have neither. We're now in asset survival. You must own things, not dollars. Cash is not a safe harbor. It's a melting ice cube. The Fed will never admit this. They'll use sanitized terms like, quote, 17 and, quote, 18. They'll never say, we're systematically transferring your wealth. But the math doesn't lie. 5% inflation for 14 years equals 50% loss. That's the plan. That's the policy. That's fiscal dominance. You pay for it with your savings, retirement, and your children's future. You're on your own. The sooner you accept this and adjust, the better your chance of surviving what's coming. Hit that subscribe button. Share this with everyone who thinks their savings account is safe. This is the information the establishment doesn't want spreading. Welcome to the new monetary regime. I'll see you in the vault.